go back to the foyer of the House of Commons right now, Parliament Hill, as we hear from the NDP finance critic Daniel Blaikie. Mr. Blaikie, thank you for joining us today.
It's my pleasure.
Now, we did hear a little bit of your leader earlier on, and obviously there are things that the party, even though it's supporting this budget, the party still sees some shortfalls with this budget. What are they in particular?
Well, there's a couple of things I would mention right off the top. One of them is employment insurance, and we're hearing from private sector economists and even in the government's own forecast that Canada is headed toward some degree of recession. We know that recessions result in a higher rate of unemployment, and we know that when Canadians are unemployed, they turn to the employment insurance system to make sure that they can still cover the bills. The government had to massively overhaul the employment insurance system during the pandemic because it wasn't up to snuff. They've been promising EI modernization for 7 or 8 years now, and they haven't delivered. So this definitely is the time. There's no better time, except earlier, to have brought about this EI reform package. And there is no mention or sign in the budget, not only that it's about to happen, but that it's going to happen anytime soon. On housing, New Democrats fought very hard to get an investment for a for Indigenous, by Indigenous housing strategy. But that's really the only substantive investment in housing, and we certainly believe and know that we need to do a lot more in the housing space, both in terms of public investment to actually have, a publicly led building of new units that are affordable or social, where the rent is geared to income. But there are also things that we could be doing to help nonprofits compete in a really difficult real estate market to try and maintain current affordable housing stock, like having a nonprofit acquisition fund and taking other measures to try and slow the financialization of housing that has already been going on for far too long and has been driving incredible price increases that now have simply priced too many Canadians out of the housing market altogether.
Mm-hmm. So housing and EI reform. Mr. Blaikie, can we go back one step? Talk to us a bit more about the EI reform. What would that actually look like to prepare the economy and really to protect Canadians if and when the economy actually goes into this downturn?
Well, I think, this is even easier to talk about and even easier to understand as a policy area for a lot of Canadians coming out of the pandemic, because they saw a lot of the changes that stakeholders are calling for, that workers are calling for to the employment insurance system, are things that we saw during the pandemic. So one universal qualifying threshold for hours, how many hours you have to work. Right now, under the old system that we've reverted back to, depends where you live in the country, and the amount of qualifying hours could be as high as 900 hours, whereas during the pandemic it was as low as 420 hours. And so we really think that having that lower universal qualifying threshold is important to make sure that less people fall through the cracks of the EI system. The income replacement rate is only 55%. During the pandemic, there was a minimum benefit of $500 a week, regardless of what your income had been. 55% is just simply too low. Even for all kinds of workers, if you're a lower wage worker, 55% of not much is not enough to live on. If you are a worker who's fortunate to have a higher paying job and you're laid off in the context of a recession, you have bills to pay that are predicated upon what you were making before. And suddenly having 45% less income makes it really difficult to make that mortgage payment or that car payment, or to go in a grocery store in this time and be able to get enough groceries to feed your family. So both in terms of the replacement rate, the idea of a minimum benefit, a lower universal qualifying threshold, these are all things that massively improve the system. And there were things that people had been calling for years before the pandemic. We saw that it was possible during the pandemic, and it's what Canadians need now. The Liberals just canceled those temporary measures in September. We had always thought that it made no sense to cancel those measures without replacing them with a more substantial EI reform, and it was to our shock and dismay in September that the Liberals tore up the temporary pandemic EI measures and still haven't replaced them, and in the budget I think we really have no plan to replace them anytime soon, despite the fact that they're warning of recession.
Mm-hmm. Now, two priorities for the NDP, of course, both a national dental care program as well as a national pharmacare program. We saw more movement with dental care, in fact, really evolving to be a larger portion of healthcare in this country. I want your reaction to that, but also a reaction to the fact that we didn't hear a lot about pharmacare in this budget.
In fact, there was no mention of pharmacare in this budget. Now, that wasn't a surprise in that the Supply and Confidence Agreement only requires that we get enabling legislation in place by the end of the year. So we're not at the end of the year. That's not a monetary commitment, so we wouldn't have expected to see spending for pharmacare in this budget. It'll be a different question once that legislative framework is in place, and then we can talk about how to get that up and running. Obviously, there'll be conversations with the provinces required in order to set that up properly. But on dental, you know, this is really big news. This is a huge breakthrough that's going to mean that millions of Canadians, seniors, people living with disabilities, children under 18, who up to now haven't had any kind of dental coverage at all, are now going to be able to go and get their teeth fixed and not worry that that means they're not going to be able to pay their bills at the end of the month. And that is a really big deal, both in terms of the human impact of being able to get that done, but I hope also for the imagination of Canadians who have been told for decades that no new major social program is possible, that people who want to see us work together and work cooperatively as Canadians in order to make sure that everyone has access to basic services are just kind of pie-in-the-sky socialists who don't understand how to run a program or what's actually possible. I think this shows that big things are possible when we put our mind to it and when we muster the political will to get them done. And so it is a very, very exciting development and something that we're very proud of in the NDP.
Yeah, you know, I have about a minute left with you, and I realize you have a busy day. But before you go, I do want to ask your reaction to the environmental incentives put into this budget, because as acknowledged by the government, here we are at this global inflection point where the decisions made now can determine the economic future of this country. What's your reaction to the host of packages introduced today?
Well, I think it's good to see Canada finally making an effort to really get in the game on this. I think it's late. You know, this is the kind of investment that we've been calling for well over a decade now. And, you know, and up to now, the government had been willing to invest. I mean, they're now $30 billion into the TMX pipeline. Our point has been, if we made investments on that scale before, instead of dumping it into the TMX pipeline, we could be in a much more competitive position right now as the world embarks on this big kind of economic moment. So it's good that Canada's getting in the game now. It really seems to be the IRA that pushed the government into getting it. Our contribution was really to insist, above all, that when public funds were going to be invested or given to companies in order to locate their investment here and their business activity here, that workers got a fair share of that pot by having jobs that are tied to the prevailing union wage that includes benefits and pension. And so the language in the budget today is really an outcome of the NDP pushing for that kind of language and trying to put workers at the center of this transition to a new energy economy to ensure that they're not getting left behind. And I think that's one of the most exciting things about the kind of clean tech investments in this budget, is that they really put workers at the center and really make it an obligation of companies, if they want to get the full tax credit, to make sure that they're treating their workers fairly and that they're paying them appropriately for the work that they're doing.
Daniel Blaikie, really appreciate the time today. Thank you.
Thank you very much.